I am so excited that we get to hear from Dr. Julia Moore today. She's the Executive Director for the Center for Implementation, a dear colleague. We have been working together on a number of projects over the years, but as I was reviewing her bio, actually, I learned a lot of new things about her, so I want to share that with you. Dr. Moore has a PhD from Penn State in human development. That's where she trained as an implementation scientist, researching the best ways to implement evidence-based programs. She worked on over 100 implementation projects. So what she will share with us today, including the tool and just her wisdom, is informed by a lot of experience working on projects. She is known internationally for her ability to communicate complex implementation science concepts in clear and practical ways. And I would underline that multiple times. We have benefited from her clarity, her visuals many times when we needed to work with implementation partners and communicate with other researchers who are not implementation scientists in a way that it's meaningful to them. She developed the online mini course, Inspiring Change, Creating Impact with Evidence-Based Implementation, which has been completed by over 9,000 professionals from around the world. So she has definitely impact beyond North America. She has worked closely with provincial, national, and international organizations to develop their knowledge, translation, and implementation plans, and is also vice chair of the board of directors for the Kids Brain Health Network. She's passionate about supporting professionals on how to use implementation science, and she has delivered dozens of workshops to thousands of participants. And today we are very lucky to hear about her work and specifically a tool that they developed through her center. And hopefully we all will benefit from that in our future work. Julie, I really appreciate you being here, and I will hand this over to you now.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Borsika. It is wonderful, wonderful to be here. I'm going to share that screen. Okay, wait. First, I'm going to ask a thing that maybe isn't allowed, but if people want to, can they go on camera? Because I like seeing people because it feels like we're like in the room together. They can go, okay. So if people want to, I love seeing your faces so that it feels like I'm not talking to no one in a void. And I'm super, super excited because we're going to show you something that is brand new. It is unreleased. It is a beta version. It is not available out there yet. And so we're going to hear about, I would love to hear what you think as we continue to refine and develop it. And so I feel like seeing people's reactions is super helpful for that. I also want to flag a couple of my colleagues are here. Carrie Costello will add stuff in the chat, and Valentina Gestaldo is the developer of all the tool, online tool, and all the beautiful things that TCI creates. And so thank you both for being here. So, okay. So really quickly, thank you, Borsika. I gave this big, long intro. Essentially, I became, I think obsessed is the only way to put it, obsessed with how we could take implementation science and now adjacent fields and make them practical and useful for the people who are on the ground implementing. And I recognize a bunch of names of people here who are trying to do some of that implementation work, and that is wonderful. And so interestingly, I was thinking as I was getting ready for this presentation that some of you might be more on the implementation like researcher end, and some people are more on the practice end, and some people are kind of on both ends. What I am presenting is truly geared towards people who are trying to do the practice while trying to stay as like loyal to the science as possible, but in this really, really practical way. But sometimes I think that when we get to present to people who are on the more researcher end, it helps challenge us to make sure that we're really doing justice to the science underneath everything it is that we're doing. So I'm really excited about that. Okay, Borsika said lots of things about me, so I will skip along, but essentially you can find lots of things about me online by Googling. It's easy. So to set the stage, I'm going to share a little story about how I got into adaptations and why I'm kind of obsessed with adaptations and obsessed with helping figure out how to better plan for adaptations. So much of what people are talking about related to adaptations is about measuring adaptations, which is essential to the work. We must be measuring adaptations. But the people I talk to are like, I am trying to plan for adaptations. What do I need to know in order to do this? And so a couple of key things. Obviously, this group of all groups knows some of these key terms that we're talking about, but like setting the stage. So when we're thinking about this, I like kind of setting the stage with my own personal adaptation fidelity debate journey. So everyone knows that there's this kind of like, ooh, fidelity is like doing the thing as intended. Adaptations is making changes to the thing. I was trained at Penn State in the United States at a time when people were very intensely debating this issue. And the message coming out was, we must have fidelity, because if we don't have fidelity, we're not going to reach outcomes. I then returned to Canada, and in Canada, the message was very different. And it was, ooh, if you will not let us adapt, you are literally not invited into the room to have this conversation about whether or not we're going to implement, because we are going to adapt no matter what. And they said, there's a systematic review that proves adaptations are better than fidelity. So like, obviously you should be making adaptations. I was confused because I was like, well, all these Americans are citing research that says fidelity is better. All these Canadians are citing this review that says adaptations are better. I was like, what is really happening? So I'm a good little researcher. I go and look at the data. I like never show data slides. It's the only data slide I think I ever show. But they talk about this Baker et al. Systematic review that said if you had a higher level of tailoring, in other words, adaptations, people are getting better outcomes than the people who are getting a moderate level of tailoring. And then I went and looked at the confidence intervals and found this super fascinating thing. Some adaptations produced way better results than the original thing that people implemented. And sometimes it made things no longer effective at all. Whereas if you didn't really change things, your results weren't really that different. And it kind of led me to this like very large aha moment that has hugely driven my worldview on adaptations, which is like, these are not inherently good or bad, but they can positively or negatively impact outcomes. And so instead of thinking about these as like, oh, are adaptations good or adaptations bad, we need to be thinking more proactively, and we need to be going into everything thinking about what is the potential impact this adaptation might have. And so that's kind of the like worldview I am coming from, because I think we don't unpack kind of like the worldviews when we're talking about adaptations, which is sometimes where people get into these tense adaptation conversations. So before I jump into showing you this tool, I would love to do, let me just make sure. Okay. Hopefully this will work. I love doing a little annotation, understanding where people are coming from. So could you see if you can annotate on the screen? To do that, it should say at the top, you are viewing Julia Moore's screen. Select the annotate button. Pick a stamp tool, and you will either have a bar like this. This is what my bar looks like. But if you have the old version, it might look like this. Then literally try to stamp on the screen. People able to stamp? Oh, there's a heart. So I would not recommend the arrow button, because Katie has an arrow button, but if somebody else has an arrow button, it will erase Katie's arrow button, because there can only be one arrow at a time. So I would highly recommend a stamp over an arrow. But you could use a text tool if you would like to. And thank you, Carrie put instructions in the chat. If you cannot put anything on the screen, you can always direct message Carrie or Valentina in the chat, and they can just write it on the screen for you. Or you can put it non-anonymously if you feel like that. But I love it because it's anonymous when we put stuff on the screen. Okay, so I'm going to clear all of these and ask you, let me clear that. Okay, when you think of adaptations, first question, what is the first thing that comes up for you? So you do that thing, type the text tool, and just like write on the screen what comes up for you first when you think adaptations. Awesome. Okay, so lots and lots of things, kind of all with a very similar theme. It looks like lots of like fit to context, tailoring for improvements, making changes, acceptable changes, making changes, responding to context, and a lot about fit to context, showing up. Awesome. So that is very in line with where we are going today in talking about how to plan for adaptations that really address these things. So, okay, so remember, my whole job is about taking implementation science and making it ultra practical so that people who are not academics can turn around and be like, oh yes, this makes sense to me. And I will confess that the adaptations literature lands on the more complex end of the implementation science content out there. I would say context and adaptations are the two pieces that people who are not implementation scientists often find the most challenging. Interestingly, things like sustainability conceptually seem easier to people. Adaptations feels very, very overwhelming. So we tried to make something super practical and lay this out as a bit of a process model. So a bit of a like, ooh, step by step, how would you go about doing this? Noting that things are not linear. So Valentina, and we worked back and forth for a long time to make this image, which is still probably going to be refined, but it outlines the steps we think of when we think of the process of making adaptations. And so we call this the map to adapt process. And so it's a bit of a roadmap that we use to think through what it looks like to make adaptations. And so it starts up here with the assess fit components, including things like identifying who to involve, defining the original initiative. I'm going to get into these in detail, identifying what you're adapting. And then we have these decision points. These points where you stop and say, whoa, 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 do not continue until you pause and answer some key questions. Like, is this a good fit? And clearly, a lot of you are already thinking about fit based on your comments on the last slide, where it's like, wait, before we even move forward, is this really a good fit to make an adaptation here? If the answer is yes, then we get into describing the adaptation, identifying the potential impacts. Remember, they could be good, they could be bad. Again, we pause before we move forward and we say, okay, do we actually adapt and move forward with implementing once we've thought through those pieces? Then we start doing things like tracking adaptations. And then a key piece no one really talks about very much is like, after you've tracked, what do you do? And so we really think there's a reflect and revisit moment that needs to happen. And so I'm going to, hopefully this will show you the other screen. So do you now see a web page? Thumbs up, yes, awesome, okay. So this is the beta version. It is not public, it is not released. We will send you the link so you can have it. Please don't share it widely because we're trying to refine and keep going, but we would love your feedback as we go. So this is the interactive tool that we have designed. It is one of a suite of tools that will ultimately be available. We'll have like a big PDF with like lots of instructions. We will have a fillable worksheet. We have shared this with 2 different groups, and fillable worksheet was the #1 thing everyone said they wanted. But this is the like interactive way to say, hey, what are the key questions? Because we hear that people find this really helpful to go through with their teams to say, hey, what belongs in here? What does this actually look like? So the tool is right here. And so you would go in, say at the first step. And so notice it's like kind of linear, but not really linear because that's the way adaptation goes. But you would start up here at the top as identifying who to involve. And so it gives you a little bit of information. This activity is to identify the people who should be involved in planning for the adaptations. And we really flag that this is a unique activity because it actually gets revisited literally at every single future activity of the entire Map to Adapt tool, because you're going to involve different people in the planning process. And so then what we've done is we've identified activities that you would actually do in this inside of here. So you would do things like describe who you're going to involve, and we have like prompting questions to help people. So are you including people who are being asked to do something differently? Are you including people who are impacted by the initiative? Are you including people who are supporting the initiative, right? Decision makers, like lots of different people. And so we're not saying you have to include these people. It's like, this is a guide to sit down with your team and say, hey, let's have a conversation about what this might look like. Who do we want to involve? And then we really define when and how we want to engage people, because different people should be involved for different reasons at different stages. We think describing the decision-making process for adaptations is unbelievably important. We are hearing more and more about situations where people are making fairly significant cultural adaptations and people feel like there's a lack of transparency about decision-making that is causing a lot of challenges and problems. So we think that that should be like made up front. What are decision-making processes about these adaptations? What does that look like? Doing things like thinking about trust, navigating power dynamics, and then asking ourselves some key questions like who is at the table, who's not at the table, why are they not at the table? Do we need a plan to get different people to the table? And to create an ongoing communication plan. We hear over and over that in the process of making adaptations, people feel like they don't know what's happening. And so let's have a plan for what's going on. And reminder, this like gets revisited constantly as we go through because you're going to engage different people as you go through different pieces. Then, so we were at the kind of first step, you're here. I'll just show up here. I like this little button. It shows the interactive components that you can click on. And so I'm going to go to the next place on this little subway map, as Russ pointed out. And so in here, this is a step that no one really talks about, but is so key. When we are making an adaptation, by definition, there is an original thing that we are changing. And we don't, I see a lot of situations where people haven't all agreed on what is the original thing. They don't all know what the original thing is. And so this is saying, hey, let's make sure we truly understand what the original thing is. So we have a bunch of activities here. Things like, what are the goals, the objectives, and the collective vision for, and we use the word initiative. We don't use the word project very intentionally, and so we often call things an initiative. It might be a program for some people. It might be, you know, a variety of different things, but we use the word initiative as kind of a catch-all term. We next say, hey, let's describe the values and principles of this initiative. One of the things we've been finding more and more is that when people are making adaptations, oftentimes what they're saying is we don't want to make adaptations to the underlying principles and values of the thing that we're implementing. Even if we're changing, like, even if we're making cultural or logistical changes, the values and principles underlying the thing we're implementing, we don't want to change. But we very, very rarely see people have explicitly written out, here are the values and principles of what we are implementing. And if those aren't written, how do we know if we're not going to make changes? We also think this is super important when scaling. So then we ask, is there a shared understanding of all of these things, right? Like, do people actually have a shared understanding of what those are? That is not always the case. I like sharing this story of, it was about a year ago. I was working on a project. They'd been working together for a year, and I got brought in to do a barriers facilitators select strategies activity. And I started by being like, oh, let's define the why of the project, thinking this was a good, like, let's bring everyone together as a like fun activity at the beginning so we can move on to like the hard stuff. 12 people on the team, they'd been working together for a year. I did a mural board, like online sticky notes activity. What do you think is the underlying why of why we're doing this program? 12 different answers. Not a little bit different, very different, like very, very different. And so it reminded me of like, just because people look like they all agree about what they're working on does not mean that's really true. And so I think that making sure, hey, do we understand what this original thing is? Because if we don't agree about the original thing, guaranteed we're going to start having problems once we get into making adaptations to this thing. And then part of that involves our language that we use is like, who's being asked to change? What are they being asked to do differently? And how are they being supported to change? What are those change or implementation strategies? So let's like lay all those pieces out. I also want to flag, because this is beta, we will eventually have other things like resources to link to for other pieces, but we're in there just starting with the key activities so we can walk through all those steps. And then we get into okay, so you have your original, who are you involving? Okay, you think about what is the original thing, and now we start saying, okay, what is it that we're talking about adopting? And so here, we're going to go through a bunch of different questions that have these two different kind of steps. One is, what is driving the need for an adaptation? Like, why is it that we're even saying, hey, let's have an adaptation conversation? For example, is the population different? How is it different? Is the setting different? Is the system different? Are the collective vision and the underlying principles different? Or sometimes there's just a resource issue. And so that one feels kind of like, I don't know, I think of Sesame Street, like different than the others, but it comes up so often that we've added it into that list. So it's like, why are we even having this conversation? And then we want to define what we're talking about making adaptations to. So are we talking about making adaptations to the who's, like the people who are impacted by the initiative, that end population, the people being asked to change, like the professionals who are being asked to do their jobs differently? Maybe it's the people supporting implementation. Are we talking about making adaptations to the what, which might be like a guideline or a program, or the hows, like those change or implementation strategies? And then depending on what we say, so often, I'm going to be honest, we're almost always making changes to some of the who's and either the what's or the hows. Very, very often we're making changes to the hows. It's rare to not make changes to the hows. Sometimes we make changes to the what's, right? That might be like the guideline you're implementing. Sometimes people do not. That one seems much more variable. But then you could go in and then there's a whole bunch of questions that are like guiding questions to talk through with your team about like what kinds of adaptations you're making. So like, are adaptations needed to reach a different population? Are the people impacted different than previous populations? And so like, do they have different barriers and facilitators? Do they have different values? And so it's like guiding questions, not answers, for you to sit down with your team and think through. And then we get to our first decision point. So these look and feel a little bit different than the last ones, because the last ones are like, oh, sit down with your team, have a conversation, engage different people. This is like a true decision point. So we need to decide who is at the table and how are we making this decision? So here, the first question is this a good fit? Something we have seen over and over is people moving forward with adaptations when in fact, if they had stopped at this point, they would have realized probably it was not even the right fit to move forward with this thing, because maybe it is not a good fit for this context. Maybe it is too different. For example, if those underlying values and principles are not the same, this is probably not the right thing to adapt. And so maybe it means picking a different thing to make an adaptation to, or developing a new thing from scratch, but it's probably not the right call to move forward with making adaptations if those things are very disconnected. But lots of times people are like, okay, yes, actually, this is a good thing. We need to make adaptations. We need to start thinking about these things. And then you can move forward and get onto the pink subway line to start planning for adaptations. So before I get into the pink subway line, I will pause for a moment and see if I have any thoughts or questions from people, because that was lots of information about the first and kind of most intense phase.
So just to help you summarize what is happening in the chat, lots of kind of exclamations that this is great, highlighting especially 2 points. One, this idea of the original intervention or initiative and what is that, and agreeing on it and different perspectives. And then the second one is this decision point that often we don't make that. But I want to see while I am talking whether there are questions. And Rebecca is asking, does implementation outcome info drive why you are adapting to?
Oh, that's a good question. Rebecca, would you come off of mute and maybe say more about what you're envisioning here?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember what content was there, but a lot of it was like the settings different, the population's different. And I wasn't seeing how, like, if it's just not acceptable to providers or patients, or it's, I mean, appropriateness gets into some of it, but just thinking through, like, you do some initial, like, early implementation and outcome stuff, and that could signal that we need to adapt something before we have to even move forward.
Yes, so that is going to come up interestingly in the very next section. And we call that kind of like our goals in making the adaptation. So it might be like, ooh, do we try to make this more acceptable? Are we trying to, right? Like, so it comes up next. But it is interesting. It's true, like driving the need for adaptations. We don't specifically have outcomes. I think that outcomes are technically implied by all those pieces, but are not specifically written as a rationale. So I'm going to make Valentina make a note of that to see if we should explore adding that piece in there.
And I definitely am not suggesting that we should make it researchy because I love how practicey this is, but just like, do people hate it? You know, like,
Yeah.
It's not that the setting is different, it's just, yeah.
Oh yeah, do people not, that's a good question. Actually, and maybe that framing it that way is like, do people not like it? Is a good why that people are adapting. And so Russ asked this question too, is like, do people complete this? So yes, pretty much all the tools that we create are designed so that teams are sitting down and doing this. So sometimes literally working on the tool together. Sometimes they have one or two people who are kind of like implementation leads, who are the ones accessing a tool and being like, hey guys, let's sit down and have a conversation about this together, so that they could be doing those things. Because what we hear people want is guidance on how to systematically have these conversations with their teams so that they're not making false assumptions before moving forward with implementing. Awesome. Okay, so I'm going to jump us back to this step right here, describing adaptations. So this brings us, Rebecca, right to what you were talking about is, so this is about, so now you've said, yes, this is probably a good fit. So we are going to start planning for the adaptations. We're not technically implementing, we're just planning for those adaptations. And so we're talking about exploring and describing the different approaches that we could use to do that. And I'm going to confess, I literally this morning sent Valentina a note because we're building as we go. We've done 2 practice sessions and I rewrote part of this. So some of this will be rewritten in the very near future. So I'm actually going to jump to number 2 first, because this is the new number 1 in a moment. And this is, what are the goals of the adaptations? And so if you are familiar with the existing adaptation frameworks, you will heavily see their influence in lots of these words. And so is our goal to increase reach or engagement, say at an individual level, adoption at a site level? Is it to increase feasibility, acceptability, appropriateness, effectiveness and outcomes, reduce costs, increase satisfaction, sustainability? Interestingly, we find that people often have very different views on teams about these different things and don't discuss that until a lot later. And you realize if your goal is to increase reach and someone else's goal is to increase health equity and someone else's goal is to reduce costs, the type of adaptations you're going to talk about making are going to be very, very different. And so I think a big goal here in setting this out at this point is to make sure that everyone understands, what are we prioritizing? Remember early on, we said, let's make sure we understand how we are making decisions. So if there are discrepancies between how people are seeing this, how do we come to consensus or some kind of agreement to move forward about what are the priorities? And then we are momentarily going to combine step 1 and step 3. Wait, pause. Can anyone hear the very loud birds outside of my window? You can. Once, no, yes, no. 1 second. Let me close my window. My apologies. I live in the country and my neighbor has guinea hens. You could look it up. They're hilarious looking birds making a lot of noise outside of my window. Okay, so the next section is about saying, okay, now let's start planning what these actual adaptations might look like. And so I'm going to give you my new wording that's not even on the board. So one is, let's go back to this. Are you making changes to the values and principles underlying the initiative? Because if you're making changes to those, we want to make sure that those are crystal clear, especially because the chances that the thing isn't a great fit happens most often right there. So let's like be super explicit about what that is and what that looks like. Then we can talk about, ooh, are you making changes to those who's? Remember we talked about it in the last step, like, ooh, who is implementing this? Are those people going to look different? How are they going to look different? And we start unpacking what that looks like and start literally making the actual changes that we're going to have to make. And then for the what's in the hows, right? That's the thing like the program or the practice and those implementation strategies. We want to ask ourselves things like, are we making changes to the content that we're delivering? are we making changes to, and so content, examples of content changes are things like, I'm seeing right now, people talk about like, ooh, we need literature on vaping that's going to be different than what we were talking about before, because as new research emerges on vaping, how we frame that, how we talk about it is going to be different. So the actual content is different. I'm doing some work with people doing HIV, implementation on HIV best practices. And the same thing is true. It's like new research is coming out. We need to actually change the content of what we're delivering. And so, yeah, so we've actually changed this concepts to be about values and principles, and explicitly saying this is about values and principles because that language is resonating better with people. And then we want to talk about, okay, are we making changes to the language, right? For example, are we putting it in Spanish? But also, are we framing this differently for different audiences, right? Like we can use different language to present and frame what we're implementing. There's this really specific one. This is based on a framework here that talks about the metaphors we use. So the example I love is we love metaphors, like love them at TCI. And we like talking about the North Star, but we do lots of work in the global South and they don't have a North Star. They technically have a Southern Star, but like, so you can't use that metaphor. Like it doesn't work anymore. So we don't realize how often those things are embedded in what it is that we're doing. But if you're implementing with a different population, you need to make sure that all of those analogies, the metaphors, the stories we have are going to resonate. And delivery, right? Do we need to change the actual delivery? Classic example we think of is like virtual versus in person, right? Like, but there's lots of different ways we change delivery. Then, once we've described the adaptations, we still have to think about this really important question. Okay, what are the potential impacts? And so this is where we want to ask ourselves, okay, do these approaches, do these planned adaptations align with the underlying goals of the actual initiative that we're planning to implement? And here, so Russ, you mentioned functions. This is where we start talking about functions. Are there changes to the functions or the principles of the what's or how's? Because often we do not want to be making changes to those functions. We often want to be making changes to like language or the delivery, but not the underlying function. And so let's unpack and understand how we truly made a change to that underlying function. And then we want to hypothesize, right? What is the potential impact of this on our goals? So maybe our goal is to increase reach. So do we think this will actually increase reach? And what is the hypothesized impact on the outcomes? We also think it's really important to ask, would this adaptation have a different impact on different groups of people? So who might benefit, who might lose if we move forward with this kind of adaptation? And are additional resources going to be needed to actually execute these? Oh, Russ is liking those. So then we get to our next decision point. This is like, do you actually move forward with doing this and implementing? So sometimes you're like, wait, these adaptations do not seem sufficient. I know someone who just said they've done all this work and realized they're implementing in an Indigenous community in Northern Ontario, and it is not the right move to do this after doing all this work. So they're pausing, they're going back, revisiting. A lot of times I'm going to admit people are here where they're like, ooh, this kind of seems good. And I also realize we probably need to make more changes. Sometimes they're like, we have to start implementing and making more changes simultaneously. But I think it's good to know that that's what's happening. And sometimes you're like, wow, our adaptations have been beautifully thought out. Yes, let's move forward and move on to tracking those adaptations. So then we get into our last section of tracking adaptations. And here we have pulled from the literature kind of key things that people have talked about tracking. And the thing we hear over and over is like, that's too many things for me to track. So we tried to come up with little asterisks beside the ones that we would say, these seem the most important if you have limited resources to track. So it's like, what are you planning to track? And literally create a plan for how you're going to track these adaptations. Sometimes for research purposes, but I'll be honest, most of the people we're helping don't have researchers that are attached to their work. And so it's not necessarily researchers who are doing that. And then that's our only one in tracking adaptations until we get to our decision point about reflecting and revisiting. And so we think it's so important. So one of the things we see over and over is people like make adaptations and then don't necessarily pause and say like, hey, were these the right ones? What do we need to do? And so we want to like gather information on how well these adaptations were actually implemented. Did people really do it? We have this good tracking data, hopefully. And then we have flagged the places that we think people are most likely to go revisit when you pause and reflect. This is the number one. Often people are like, ooh, we did not involve all of the right people. We need to go back, redo some steps with different people. Lots of times people have not identified all the components they need to make adaptations to. And sometimes people realize, ooh, there might have been potential impacts, negative impacts that we had not anticipated. We want to go back and think about those. And so then we recommend people kind of go back and revisit and jump back to different parts. And so you can just like hop in, take your team and be like, ooh, actually, maybe we should go back and like relook at one of those sections and discuss what that would look like. So I'm going to flip us back here. And so I have two little activities and then opening it up to Q&A. So the first, hold on. Oh, my present, sorry, not present and record, present. Okay. There we go. So I would love if people would go on the screen and annotate, or you could share things in the chat, things that you liked and things that you think could be improved or you'd like to see more of. So for example, we did this twice. We've done this twice in the past month. And everyone was like, I want a worksheet. I want a fillable worksheet to go along with this. It was number one, the most crystal clear thing. And so Valentina said yesterday, I'm starting the fillable worksheet. Like it's in progress. That is the first thing on the list. So don't add that because we know that is coming. It was very clear that is top of mind for everyone. But what else would you like? How else would you want to restructure anything? Any feedback you have? If you could type things in the chat or type them on the board, perfect, like that. And a reminder, if you can't, oh, I can move that. To annotate, it says you're viewing Julia Moore's screen. And then click view options, annotate, and then you can click on the text tool. Oh yeah, and thanks, Valentina. If there's anything specific you want in that worksheet, Valentina's on it, and so let her know because I think she would love any input. Yeah. Awesome. As people add things, I have one explicit question for people, especially in this group, which is, I've had this internal debate about how much would people want a like cross-reference. So I am Adapt just got mentioned, and like Frame and Frame IS. Would someone want an actual sheet that is like, ooh, like Frame IS has this section, and like, where does that exist in the tool? Because it's like almost all that content exists somewhere. We took every adaptation framework we could find and tried to summarize them and synthesize them, but they like look different because the audience is different. And so I think one of my questions is, would people want that cross-reference sheet so that they can go and find those pieces?
I will jump in with that. I think that one of the tremendous strengths of this is that it doesn't feel overwhelming. And I think frame IS perhaps a little bit less, but the original frame is a little bit more overwhelming because of the complexity, which I think as researchers we might appreciate. But every time we show it to new audience or practitioners, they give up at that moment. That was the last time they wanted to talk about adaptations. And so I think that for me, for the audience that you are working with or prioritizing, perhaps that's less important. But for the researchers to have some in the back that they can kind of cross-reference without making the tool overly complex, that we might feel good about that, or it might be a good academic exercise.
Awesome. Okay. So, and I'm seeing some people cross-reference sheets would be very appreciated. So it sounds like that. So I'm not making it up, that people would want to potentially see those pieces. Maria.
Yeah, this is great, Julia. I think, yeah, cross-referencing would be good, and maybe with a little bit of description on, you know, how this tool might be a little bit different than this other one, right? So, you know, when I was certainly like the overarching structure of like thinking about what you're adapting and making adaptations, et cetera, is like similar to I Am Adapt. But I think well, one thing that Borsig has said about frame is certainly true for I Am Adapt. Much more detailed, much more involved, maybe overwhelmingly so for some people, and might not want to. So that's what's great about this. Like, it's more simplified. On the other hand, like if somebody really wants to go in and like create a logic model of their of the intervention that they're adapting and compare it to the logic model of the needs and make decisions on what content needs to change and what the core elements actually might be, and have the data carry through that they're entering. If they want to go into that level of detail, then they might want to use sort of an expert system like that, or a tool like that. So, and then frame, you know, same thing. Like if somebody wants to sort of dig into, you know, more specifics about those, that tracking or whatever. So I think that, yeah, cross-referencing with maybe a little explanation of like, here's what that would give you. And then I guess another thing that that I think about is, you know, I wonder, certainly this would require like funding and time and energy and stuff, but I wonder if there's like a way to sort of bring them actually together in a tool that's like talking to each other. I don't know. It's sort of like pie in the sky a little bit right now, but I think, you know, it would be great to be able to have like a user's experience be sort of seamless in that way, right? That if they want to dig into a particular space or area that they're able to. So anyway, something to think about for the future. But yeah, really nice. Thanks for the presentation.
Awesome. Well, and I can share a couple thoughts. One is, so one of the next things we're going to add is these like additional resources. And so one of the thoughts I have is additional resources that might be divided, like, so Valentina makes those pop-ups, right? So like a thing would pop up, and then on one side of the page, they would be more academic. So some of our audience do want the academic thing. So it'll link you to, right, the article, the different pieces, because some people want that. And some people want the like, okay, like, let's define the who's and what's and how's. And some people are like, okay, wait, what's the difference between a who and a what and how? Oh, and I forgot a really key thing. We now are going to have a distinction on our website between beginner to or foundational tools and advanced tools, and this is an advanced tool, because like you can't do this if you don't know those foundational pieces. Like you just can't, right? Like you can't. If you don't understand what the barriers and facilitators to select implementation strategies means, then like you're not ready for this level of talking about things. Okay, so let me save this because these are awesome. And Carrie, you have a screenshot of these, I hope? Yes, probably. And I will clear these and take us into, I feel like we've already started this, but this is literally leads into my Q&A. So kind of Q&A, you can write things on the board. Some people want them anonymous. Come off mute. Yeah, type in the chat any way that people have thoughts, questions, ideas, reflections. I can see Valentina's being given lots of ideas for things to include in the worksheets. So thank you for those. But anything else related to Map to Adapt or any of these kind of like linked pieces, other frameworks, other pieces. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Julia. I just wanted to say this was so exciting to see, and as we said, your ability to make things accessible about implementation science is always exciting. I will have a question, but I wanted to encourage everyone, as you have done beautifully, to unmute and come on with questions or put it in the chat or use this really nice interactive board. While everyone is thinking, just a quick question. So if you were to say, what are the 2 or 3 top use cases for this Map to Adapt? What would be the scenarios when you would want people to think of it and bring it into their work? What would be those?
Okay, so I think the number one that I'm getting right now is situations where people so often researchers have designed something to implement. They have tested it a variety of times. And currently we have a bunch of situations where an intermediary organization says, awesome, great job, guys. We would love to help spread and scale that to hundreds of different sites. Can we do that? And can we do it in a way that allows adaptations to the local context? So I'm working on one right now where it's about long-term care homes and connecting with community partners. It was built in one specific province and they're talking about scaling it across the entire country. And so like true adaptations are needed at every level. Like there's system level policy adaptations down to the like personal support worker who needs to do something different that does need to be adapted. So we've recognized there need to be adaptations at all these levels. I am helping walk them through the process of what that looks like. But the point is, how could the teams do this? And so I'm essentially walking these through these steps. How could the teams do that on their own? The other example I'm seeing is, we know a group right now in California that is adapting an existing evidence-based program to make it more equity focused because it is a long-standing, very highly evidence-based program that maybe doesn't consider equity in a 2024 way. And so this is literally like, how can they sit down and think through what this looks like with their team? They're very advanced implementation support practitioners. And so how can they walk through it in that way? So those are kind of, I would say, the really common ideas that come to mind for me.
This is super helpful. Thank you. I'm sure this gave plenty of time for folks to have formulated questions, so feel free to unmute and come on.
Borsika asked about use cases, Julia, and somebody else put examples in the chat about doing that. I'm just wondering about your experience or your thoughts about ways to do that. And one thing I appreciate your feedback on, we've been talking a lot about very brief videos targeted on that. Just wondering about your thoughts, pros and cons, if that's worth it, if people really click on those and use them, just your thoughts about that.
So that's so funny, Russ. So I was literally like doing this practice presentation and then like when I work in a barn. And so then went back to the house for like 2 seconds to grab my water and then come back. And I was thinking like, ooh, like everyone wants examples. What are our examples going to look like? And this morning I was just answering questions to our online courses. So we have like all these online courses and I answer every single question. And people love these short audio clip only examples that we give. So we have these like, they're often like 90 seconds to 3 minute descriptions, audio only. Occasionally, in fact, Valentina, for one of the courses, because it was more complex, it was our complexity course, there was like a little visual and an audio clip over that visual. And people are like, wow, this brought to life for me how much this relates to my own work. And so literally I was just thinking, oh, is that what we're going to need to do? Are we going to need to make these audio clips? What is that going to look like? Would they live in the tool? Because I was at first thinking the examples would live inside this big PDF that will come with this. Yep. But if they're audio clips, maybe they live in here. So I don't have an answer, but that's the thought of my morning thought today on that note. And audio clips are so much easier to produce.
We might have to steal that idea for our
do it.
tools. So Just want to pre-warn you that you might
No.
see that this is fantastic. It sounds like it would be relatively low tech, but
Yeah.
still connecting and very specific. Okay, very helpful.
Yeah, like, and an image with an audio clip overlay, I think, is the dream. But even just an audio is better than a video, and videos just take so much more time to produce and like set up than just an audio clip. So, and definitely take anything. We are big believers in, like, we're trying to synthesize and translate this to make it easier. So anything we can do to make that happen. I will just flag, anyone else can jump in, but if you want lots of stuff, it sounds like lots of people know, well, I recognize lots of people's names, but we have lots of things in our toolbox, all of our images and stuff, lots of ways to connect with us, our newsletter, and things like that. So I will stop sharing so that I can see even more faces, but
thank you so much. We have a few more minutes, so please formulate your questions. Come on. I did want to say, if I may, that now at UCSD, we have 3 of our project managers, including Kara, who are certified implementation specialists through Julia's program. And this is a really nice addition to their skill set, but also as we are writing grants, we are now writing them in as implementation specialists to extend our team. So we have, in a personnel, we talk about them not only as they manage the programs, but contribute to the implementation work. And I think that that's a major addition. So I just wanted to highlight that.
That's amazing. And actually, you guys should use that as an example. We've been talking about what are great examples of when we get to use implementation practitioners can help drive the implementation research questions. And that's a beautiful example of where that can happen if you have those people embedded on the team.
Yes.
I had a question, which I don't know if you've thought through this, but I know you mentioned that there's a plan to do worksheets because a lot of people have been requesting that. Is there a plan to then collect part of the data for whoever will be utilizing this tool once you have it published? Or is that going to be not, of interest to you all to know what kinds of things people are using the tool for?
So that's a super complicated question for us. So one, I should clarify, like, the tool will be, quote, launched and publicly available, but won't actually be published because we're not academics. So we don't publish articles.
Okay, I meant launched, sorry. Launched
but I actually think, but lots of people are like, oh, when will you publish this tool in an academic article? And I'm like, never. So 2 is, it's like, we wouldn't actively use data for research purposes. We only use it for feedback to improve the tool purposes. Okay. So historically, we've never collected data because it enters this very fuzzy place of, we need to store the data and then figure out, like, what is okay to share and not share. And the adaptation stuff does become a little bit more complex. Like it has, I think, implications. So typically we have not collected the data. And so I think our inclination would be to create worksheets that people get to use on their own so that we're not housing other people's data.
Okay, thank you. That answers my question.
Russ is asking about the type of facilitator someone needs. So you definitely don't need a TCI staff because our whole point of existence is we are a very tiny team. And so you can't, that's not the goal. In fact, part of the reason Borska mentioned the certificate program, a huge part of the reason we built the certificate program is the idea is people in the certificate program who've completed the level 1 certificate are excellent people to use the 2 tools that we have available, or especially the strategies tool that we have available, right? Like, it is literally set you up to be able to facilitate conversations about this. This tool is going to be into, there's 4 courses in level 2, and it's going into the 4th course for level 2. And so I think that maybe some level 1 facilitators could do it. Sometimes you might need someone who has a bit more expertise and experience. But the idea, our whole goal is like, let's scale how many people in the world can do this and facilitate that conversation.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, everyone. We are at the top of the hour. This was really a great way to start my week. I learned a lot of tricks that I would like to incorporate in our work, and then also will guide people to access this once, launched and available. Thank you for the presentation. Thank you for your team, Julia, for being here. And I just wanted to tell everyone that we are planning to meet in October. We are going to meet October 21 because the 14th is Indigenous People Day. And so we are going to send out information about the content. We are finalizing the content for that meeting. And please email us in between. And again, just wanted to say one more time, thank you, Julia. Thank you, Julia's team.
Thank you so much, Borska, for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.